Hello there, prisoner. It appears you may have got some things wrong in your last video. Chop chop, you've got fixing to do. Hey there everyone, so I've got one more video about Dark Souls before I get back to regular Let's Draw content. I know it's been way too long. I just wanted to quickly throw out some minor corrections on the last video I made. I know it's shocking that someone as well adjusted as me could be wrong about stuff, but unfortunately this is the world we live in. That said, even though I'm willing to admit my mistakes, I'm not going to remove the previous video, both to own my mistakes and also help provide some context for this video. So, to start off, we have the largest correction, which is how I was working on the assumption that Black Knight weapons and unique items as a whole were the main cause for my shortcomings in regards to co-op matchmaking. This is not entirely the case, but the truth does still bring its own particular issues with it, which I will touch on shortly. My misconception about what was going on with Black Knight weapons was that simply picking them up was putting me into a different matchmaking tier, and that's not technically wrong. But with more information on hand surrounding this system, we can kind of pick apart what's actually happening here. So in the week between the last video and this one, I shared the previous video onto the Dark Souls Reddit page, which opened up discussion about what was happening here. It's been gradually uncovered by the more investigative Dark Souls players that weapon matchmaking works by using your highest upgraded equipment, specifically weapons, shields, and your pyromancy flame. Other equipment items like catalysts, talismans, armor, rings, and spells don't count towards your matchmaking level, however, but the items that do operate on a fairly simple system. So let's say, for sake of example, you somehow only have one weapon in your entire inventory and you gradually upgrade it over the course of the game. It should reliably scale your matchmaking along with it. At least this is no doubt what the thinking behind the system was. The thing that starts to throw a needless spanner in the works is that Black Knight and other unique items, for example, tail cut weapons, boss weapons, and generally anything that's upgraded using something that isn't regular or Titanite, is considered a +5 weapon from the moment you pick it up, no upgrades required. This is clearly to help balance the stronger equipment against the regular weapons most players are more likely going to be using at low levels, and that's fine, it kinda works as far as I'm concerned, although I would argue that throwing players into a matchmaking level higher than what they're arguably used to just for picking up a particular weapon is a bit botched. Especially when you consider that the system doesn't take into account whether the player can use the item or not. So in the previous video when I said, if I have a Black Knight greatsword but only 16 strength, should that count towards my weapon level? I was right to be a little annoyed about this. In my opinion, having a higher matchmaking tier pushed on you for getting a weapon that you can't use is a little broken. Also, it's worth mentioning for those who aren't aware, you can't choose whether you pick up a Black Knight weapon or not. When they die, their weapons just end up in your inventory, so if you want them or not, they're there, irreparably screwing up your matchmaking for the rest of the game. The only solution to this problem is to just not fight the Black Knights or pick up any unique items, but I don't believe that effectively gating content from the player because they want to maintain a matchmaking level is good design in any sense of the word. Especially for a remaster where the main focus should arguably be for old and new players to experience as much as they possibly can. My second point is something that I didn't really outright state, but I feel like I kind of alluded to in the previous video, and that was the idea that these unique weapons would work in a cumulative way in regards to your matchmaking. Basically, I was working on the assumption that the weapon level system worked by using a background score from all of your weapons altogether. So you'd have tier 1 and then you'd gain a certain amount of weapon based points, for sake of example, either from acquiring more and more powerful weapons or by upgrading them, and then you'd move on to the next tier. This, thankfully, isn't the case. It turns out you can have as many unique items as you want, as long as you don't upgrade them or anything else, you will remain at a flat +5 weapon level. It's only if you upgrade something past +5 that you'll move on to the next one, which I think is where my issue is stemming from. Divine Claymores, I want to say, technically start off as +6 weapons, as you have to upgrade a regular weapon to +5 and then modify it to make it divine. And a +10 Claymore is considered a +15 regular weapon by the matchmaking, and this does make a fair amount of sense. It has the same amount of upgrade levels required, it's basically the same amount of materials. It is just a little too numbersy for my liking, and this information was never really well explained by the developer. In fact, the main gripe most people seem to have is that it outright wasn't explained by the developer. I've seen posts from people who have claimed to have bought the remastered strategy guide and have found conflicting, possibly even outdated information about the matchmaking in it. And that just shouldn't be happening. Not in 2018, especially in a guide for a remaster of a game that the developers claimed they had barely changed. So now that I've cleared up the larger part of my argument in the previous video and made my position a little clearer and hopefully enhanced not just my understanding but your understanding to a point where we can now focus on what is necessary for our builds going forward in regards to co-op, I think maybe it's time to revisit my overall verdict. Does this ruin co-op like I said it did? Well, for my needs and wants, yeah, it still kind of does. But I think a more honest and fair way to put it would be that Dark Souls Remastered made co-op overcomplicated. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. What I think is a bad thing, however, is the reason behind overcomplicating it. As I said in the previous video, these changes were most likely put in place to combat low-level twinking in PvP, and to that end, they failed, outright. They outright failed with it. Twinking in PvP is just as rampant as it was in the original, if not more, because, well, the kind of people who are invading new players in the remaster are the ones armed with the prior knowledge of how to beat the game's systems, the ones who know where all the overpowered stuff is, they've committed the more regrettable tactics to their memory, they know all the glitches and exploits, they're bloodthirsty, and they're looking for easy kills above anything else. There's this kind of, and believe me, I kind of regret to use this word, toxic opinion surrounding new players in the Souls series. I even had an example of this bitter mentality in the comments of my previous video, where the new player should be effectively thrown to the wolves to weed out the weak. This was in response to my perspective, where I feel there's no harm in helping a less experienced player to get past a hard boss so they can experience the rest of the game and gain the knowledge themselves that way. And then there's this really bizarre mentality that I've seen, and this kind of became more prevalent with the announcement of the Switch version for the remaster, where people were saying, hopefully as a joke by the way, that they'd get the game to essentially gatekeep the Nintendo scrubs from getting too far into the game and making them quit. These are the kinds of players who are gunning for these underhanded twink tactics in PvP, and they're seemingly the ones who are getting punished or limited the least by this new matchmaking system. And to expand on that, it genuinely feels like the only people who are being punished or limited with this system are the people who don't know how it works, or people like me who want to engage in the co-op side of online content to help people get through the game for the first time. But hey, at least now when I get backstabbed by a Havel monster wielding a chaos-infused large club with power within, I'll know their weapons were at least the same level as mine. Well done, guys. You done goofed on it.